Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll be sharing my time with my great colleague from Yorkton, Melville. This is an important report from the Foreign Affairs Committee, which focuses on many actions that are required from Canada in terms of continuing but strengthening our support for the people of Ukraine. Mr. Speaker, this week at the Subcommittee on International Human Rights, we had harrowing testimony about how, as part of their illegal genocidal invasion of Ukraine, Russia is using child abduction. The children are being abducted from Ukraine, brought to Russia, and this is part of the genocidal campaign of the Putin regime. Harrowing testimony, and we'll be hearing directly from victims at next Tuesday's hearings. This underlines how critical it is that we stand with Ukraine, that we fight for freedom, that we stand for truth and justice. In particular, from yesterday's testimony, the point was made about Ukraine's territorial integrity. The territorial integrity is not simply or primarily a matter of land. It is a matter of people. That when Russia takes over or tries to take over territory, it is not just stealing land. Russia, the Russian regime, is involved in a campaign of stealing people, of forcing people into their authoritarian orbit, of a campaign of sexual violence, and of stealing children from their families. So when Ukraine fights for territorial integrity, when it demands respect for territorial integrity, this is not just or primarily a matter of land, it is a matter of people, preventing the Putin regime from stealing people. Mr. Speaker, this report, a unanimous report from the Foreign Affairs Committee, which we are seeking to concur in today, has many different recommendations, all of which are important, many of which speak to justice, to bringing the aggressor to justice, to steps Canada can take, including, for instance, supporting the Special Tribunal for the crime of aggression. Recommendation 4 speaks of expelling diplomats, some creative ways of getting information to the Russian people, such as supporting free and open internet in Russia through the use of technology such as virtual private networks. Many recommendations which are valuable and I think would be relatively uncontroversial in this House. I wanted to focus in my remarks on two recommendations, that is Recommendation 12 and Recommendation 15. Recommendation 12 of this report says the Government of Canada not grant a sanctions waiver to Siemens Energy Canada Limited for Nord Stream 1 pipeline turbines as long as sanctions remain in effect. This was an important recommendation because last summer, instead of working to bring Canadian energy to Europe to displace Russian oil and gas exports, instead of trying to use Canadian energy as a tool to reduce European dependence on Russia, this government was granting a permit to an exception to sanctions to allow the export of turbines to facilitate Russian energy exports to Europe. Rather than helping to create jobs in Canada and support energy export from Canada to Europe, this government was more interested in allowing turbines that would facilitate the export of energy from Russia to Europe. And Russian energy exports have been critical for the Putin regime as they try to maintain their war. It's fueling the violence we're seeing, their selling of energy. And I think the area where this government has been the weakest when it comes to supporting our allies in their fight against the Putin regime is not understanding the importance of energy security and not understanding the crucial role that Canada could play. And it's a win-win-win, Mr. Speaker. Exporting our energy, developing our energy sector, and supporting the rapid export of those energy resources to Europe. It's good for European security and it's good for our economy. But so often we talk about energy as an economic issue only. It's an economic issue, but it's also a global security issue because most of the world's democracies are geographically small, densely populated nations that rely on energy imports. And as long as those nations are buying gas from Russia, they are sending back money which is being used as part of this horrific campaign of genocidal violence against Ukraine. So Canada, as a geographically large, sparsely populated country rich in natural resources, we have a unique and special role to play if we develop our energy sector and we export that energy, displacing that dependence. Instead, last summer, instead of thinking about this economic opportunity and security imperative, this government was granting a turbine to facilitate continuing exports of gas from Russia through Nord Stream 1 pipeline. This was a massive betrayal of our allies in Ukraine. And we had the ambassador from Ukraine before the Foreign Affairs Committee that was very clear about the fact that this was not at all what the Ukrainian government wanted. The Ukrainian government recognized the vital importance of allies standing united in imposing those sanctions, and this government failed. That's recommendation 12, Mr. Speaker, and I think it's important that the House concur in that recommendation as a sign of support for Ukraine. And to be clear, that never again should we allow the kind of weakening of sanctions that we saw last fall. Eventually, finally, after months, the government pulled back on that permit after sustained opposition pressure, but frankly, it sent a very negative and counterproductive message at the time. Finally, I want to speak about Recommendation 15. Recommendation 15 calls on the Government of Canada to list the Wagner Group, a Russian mercenary organization, as a terrorist group under the Criminal Code. And this would be a critical step. The Wagner Group is responsible for horrific violence in Ukraine, but also for violence in other parts of the world. The Wagner Group is an organization, notionally private military organization with close affiliation with the Russian government. Historically, of course, there have been some structural changes since the abortive coup that we saw, and some further developments since this report was tabled, although it still, I think, makes good sense to list the Wagner Group as a terrorist organization as per this recommendation, as well as to look for the ways in which the sort of institutional architecture of this oppression evolves or shifts as the Russian government kind of responds to the abortive coup that took place. But the call for the listing of the Wagner Group as a terrorist organization, it's important in terms of delivering justice for the people of Ukraine and holding these violent terrorists accountable. It's also important for people of many other countries. There are many countries in Africa where the Wagner Group has been operating, has been in effect stealing from the people of those countries, and has been responsible for absolutely brutal campaigns of violence within those countries. We see the increasing deployment and use of the Wagner Group in particular in Africa, responsible for so much death and destruction, and a kind of neo-colonial policy of the Russian government, trying to subject African countries and to deploy this violence against vulnerable people. This Liberal government has refused calls to list the Wagner Group as a terrorist organization. There was a unanimous consent motion in the House calling for that listing. There was this recommendation of the Foreign Affairs Committee, unanimous recommendation at the level of the Foreign Affairs Committee, I believe, calling for the listing of Wagner as a terrorist organization. This is another way where we need to see this Liberal government step up in terms of its support for Ukraine. So many different positive recommendations here in terms of bringing the Putin regime to justice, in terms of providing military and humanitarian support for Ukraine. All recommendations that Conservatives support. We strongly support the actions that are required, quickly delivering the support necessary to the people of Ukraine. And again, I want to particularly highlight these two recommendations where the government has been, unfortunately, missing in action. Number 12 on energy security. If Canada is going to support Ukraine effectively, we must attend to the energy security dimension of this conflict. We must attend to the reality that the Russian regime relies on energy exports in order to fund this aggressive war, and Canada can provide an alternative for countries that have in the past been dependent on Russia. We must attend to the energy security dimension, and we must recognize the terrorist groups like the Wagner Group that the Russian regime is using for violence in Ukraine, for violence at home, and indeed for violence around the world. Concurring in this 10th report, including recognizing the importance of those particular recommendations, would go a long way, and we're proud to propose that the House take these steps today to make these important acts of recognition. Thank you.